Chapter 21, Wild Indigo, August 1856. James cleaned the ashes out of the fireplace. "Thee's been promising since June," his mother reminded him. Rebecca slept hunched in the rocker, still weak after her bout with the fever. Seemed like everyone was sick. They had it over at the Mackins, and even Governor Robinson, who the pro-slavers said wasn't the governor, was down with it. In town, people were whispering cholera and talking about the epidemic that swept through here not 10 years before, wiping out whites and Negroes and Indians alike. But the runty Dr. Olney said, "These got nothing to stew about, folks. Believe me, I'm a product of the Harvard Medical College. It's just a simple ague going around now." He gave everyone quinine and told them to sleep and sweat it away. Tonight, when he'd come to check on Rebecca, he'd said, "She's out of the woods. She's over the crest." Ma said, "Praise the good Lord." "Yes, sir. The child's come through the dark of the night. She's turned the corner. We're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I tell thee, that quinine's a miracle drug. Wish I had the patent. I know thee has many calls to make tonight, and that sweet baby to get home to," Ma said, urging him toward the door. She never mentioned the wild indigo tea, but he was barely out to the road when Miss Lisbeth said with a snort, "Quinine my left elbow. It was the roots did it." Now Ma and Miss Lisbeth sat at the table working on Lisbeth's reading. She labored with writing the letters because she was left-handed, and Ma could only show her how to work the right-handed way. It gave James a hearty satisfaction to see Miss Lisbeth struggling. "I'll never get it, Miss Weaver." "Nonsense." Ma stood up behind her and tried to guide her hand. "Maybe this is why thee has such a struggle sewing," Ma said with a sigh. "Should never have been G's invented," Miss Lisbeth muttered. "Too fancy and curly to write." James stuck his head back into the chimney and felt drops. "It's raining. I sure can't sweep up wet ashes." "Work quickly before they turn to mud," Ma said. "And save every bit of the ash, son, because I'll be leaching it in the fall and using the lye to make my soap." In Boston, they'd bought soap fragrant as violets. Out here, Mrs. Mackin was teaching Ma to make her own soap. A brown crock stood at the back of the stove, and into it went every drop of fat Ma could save. James couldn't imagine washing in anything made from ashes and lard. How do you get clean when you smell like a pig? "The rain better stop," Miss Lisbeth said, "because I'm going out on tonight." James bumped his head on the stone in his excitement. Finally, he looked up and saw Ma's disapproving eyes. "It's threatening a storm, child." Miss Lisbeth slammed her copybook shut. "I have to leave tonight. Folks are expecting me." "Thee will catch thy death," Ma said, flattening the copybook open again. "Now watch here. Thy O's must be as round as tiny moons." "The minute it gets dark," Miss Lisbeth said, "my rucksack's all packed." "I urge thee to reconsider." She shook her head. "There's good moonlight to guide me, Miss Weaver, trusting the storm doesn't cover it up. By the time I get to these folks down in Missouri, there will be only a sliver of moon, so our trip back here will be safe." "But Lisbeth," "Amen," she said firmly. It wasn't just one wagon or two. It was a whole train of them that James watched come over the hill, looking like they'd fall headfirst into a ravine. Their white covers billowed in the Kansas wind like sails on the open sea. In fact, folks were calling these wagons prairie schooners, and they were headed right for the middle of town. James walked alongside the wagons and the beat-up-looking oxen that pulled them. Plumb in the middle of Massachusetts Street, the lead wagon stopped, all the others waiting behind like obedient ducklings. People began to tumble out of the wagons, stretching, yawning, and turning their faces toward the sun. A rumpled-looking man bumped right into James. "Lord, I never expected to stop in such a pretty town. This is just about the Garden of Eden. I expect thee's been traveling a good long while, if thee thinks that." "Thee? What are you, a Bible person? Quaker, sir, we're friends. Well, sure we're friends. Molly, hun, come over here and meet my new young friend. Molly waddled from around the other side of the wagon. She proved to be a woman fixing to burst. James figured Lawrence would be adding one more name to its rolls before the day was out. You got a doctor here? Molly growled. Yes, ma'am, Dr. Olney and Dr. Robinson. Both, but a Dr. Robinson's usually away on government business. Best you be going for Dr. Olney, the woman said, holding on to her heaving belly. Heart pounding, James ran for Dr. Olney's house. Dr. Olney, sir, there's a woman over by the hotel who is about to foal. Better come. James led the doctor through the maze of wagons to Molly, who was as pale as the cover on the wagon and clutching its ropes. Dr. Olney helped her up to the wagon, and they disappeared inside, while Molly's husband paced. I may look old, but I sure never had a baby before, he told James. Molly, she's a good sport. She wanted to come along for the ride to Oregon, so I married her proper, after 50-some years as a bachelor. James meant to listen as the man who called himself Jed Pryor revealed 50 years of his personal history, but James's attention was drawn to the house across the street, Bethany Maxwell's house. Mr. Maxwell propped his door open and began carrying out trunks and boxes and barrels. One trip he had a 100-pound sack of flour flung over his back like a dead body, and he was loading everything onto one of the wagons. Then Bethany came out, with her cat curled in her arm. Oh, hello, James Weaver. Is thy pa leaving? All of us, she said morosely. She buried her face in the back fur of the cat. James swallowed around a lump the size of a goose egg. My mother says no more. No more warring, and no more bleeding, Kansas, and no more flooding, and no more lightning and thunder. Where's thee going? James asked, thunderstruck himself by how Bethany Maxwell's hair was just the color of the cat's fur and her eyes like early dusk. My Uncle Lewis has come for us from Cincinnati. We're following the Oregon Trail. Thee's bound for adventure, James said bravely, but it's clear over the other side of the mountains, and I can't take Trembles. You could keep him for me. She thrust the cat into James' arms. He's an outside cat. He won't scratch at your door or anything rude like that. Tremble scurried out of James's grasp and wound himself around Bethany's leg. She tried to ignore him. We're sleeping in the wagon tonight and leaving at first light. She picked up a small satchel her father had left on the porch. I can't take much. What was he supposed to say? Certainly not, I'm going to shrivel up and die without thee, though he suspected he might just do that. I'll remember you, James, over on the other side of the mountain, because I never met anybody who said thee and thy before. I can say you and your. No, don't. Now take Trembles, or I'll cry right here on the street. She slid away from the cat, and James grabbed him up and ran home. It wasn't until he was inside with Trembles that he wondered just what kind of baby Molly and Jed Pryor would be taking the rest of the way on the Oregon Trail. Pa pulled off his traveling boots. It's so far from place to place out here, he said, settling into the biggest chair on the porch. Thought I'd not make it home to sleep in my own bed tonight. Mom misses thee when thee's gone away on business, James said. Trembles came around the corner and hissed at Pa. Who's that? Just a cat. The Maxwells left him in our keeping. They went off to Oregon while you were away. James fiddled with a knife and a stick, making it look like he was idly whittling strips off the cottonwood branch when he was actually carving little figures in it. If it turned out all right, he'd give it to Pa for a letter opener, and if it didn't turn out all right, he'd use it to stir up anthills. Ma brought them out some lemonade. Hush thy voices so Rebecca doesn't hear and clamber out of bed. I'm afraid we've spoiled her fiercely through her illness. I trust Simon Olney was a help. Oh, yes, Ma said quickly. Came out 3 times. Not a word about Miss Lisbeth's wild indigo tea. The man is a veritable symphony of hackneyed expressions. He pronounced our Rebecca fit as a fiddle, tight as a drum, and snug as a bug in a rug. Pa laughed as he polished his scuffed boots. This was James's favorite time of the day, when the daylight finally gave in to dusk, and the sun was just a memory, a ripple of soft purples in the horizon. 10 more minutes, and it would be too dark to carve without bloodying his fingers, or worse, making a mess of the scarce wood. He asked, "Pa, did thee find Solomon?" "I did," Pa said, letting out a deep sigh. "They have a different interpretation of the law down there." "Thee wasn't able to bring the man back?" asked Ma, taking up her knitting. "Well, Mrs. Weaver, they can't deny I've got legal papers proving Solomon's a free man, but they surely can take a long time looking those papers over." Ma's needles clicked furiously. There came a clattering of wagons' wheels from out of the sunset, and Ma stuffed her knitting behind her and folded her hands in her lap. James felt his heart leap. 8 days had passed since Miss Lisbeth had left in the storm. Was this her promised load of negroes? The wagon drew nearer, and James heard raucous laughter. He stood up to get a better look. One man held the reins, and the other stood up against the sunset and tilted a jug back toward his mouth, wiping his face in a shirt sleeve. He shouted, "Ain't never seen a sunset like this since I've come back from Gay Paris." "Hell, you ain't never been into Paris," the driver said, yanking the jug away. He took a good long slug of the contents, too. James smiled to himself, imagining what it must feel like to be so freely drunk. Pa muttered, "Scallywags, I'll go head them off." But Ma jumped up and said, "Caleb Weaver, this requires a woman's firm hand. I'll scold them as if I were their own mother. James, thee come out to greet them with me. He'll protect me, Mr. Weaver. Thee's had a long day of travel." Pa seemed only too glad to sit back as James followed Ma and her long swishing skirt down to the wagon. The driver doffed his sweaty hand at Ma. "Evening, missus. Don't pay us no mind. We been to the well." The other man thought this was hilarious, and he bellowed with laughter. "Are thee drunk?" Ma hissed, snatching the jug away from the driver. She poured what was left on the ground. "James, poke around in the back of the wagon," Ma said, and then the driver turned sober all of a sudden. "You Miss Weaver?" "I am. Well, I brought those bolts of cloth you ordered from down in Missouri. Real pretty calico. Gift from a Miss Charles." "I simply can't accept the gift, sir, generous as it is. We're proud people out here on the prairie." James climbed carefully into the wagon so as not to trample anything or anyone. He lifted a corner of the buffalo rope and saw 2 eyes, which snapped shut right away. He jumped out the wagon. Ma said in a voice much louder than usual, "I don't mean to be inhospitable, but my husband's up on the porch, and he's weary from a day of travel, and I believe thee had best be on thy way. Perhaps someone further up the line can use that good cloth." "Well, ma'am, I've got strict orders to deliver this load to you and no one but." Ma came around to the far side of the wagon and whispered, "There's 2 walls of a soddy just up the road, beside a stream. Not much water this time of the year, but enough to refresh the horses. Drive that wagon about until thee sees all the lights go out in our house. Thee can stay the night there, but be gone by the first sun. Hear?" "Amen," came a voice from under the buffalo's robe.